little bit about sort of how we came to get this book. It was something that I'd wanted to do since I was a young girl, probably about 15 years old. I'd heard some of the stories growing up. Around the dinner table, my dad would tell us some stories. I didn't quite understand how they all fit together. I asked my brothers a couple times. I have 3 other older brothers, and they didn't quite understand how these stories fit together. And I think we were all a little bit confused, but no one wanted to ask any questions. And I think that's sort of common after having talked to quite a few people. When somebody's gone through events like this, you don't want to bring up bad memories. You don't want them to feel like you're prodding into their life. And I think we were all very curious, but we didn't talk about it. So at 15, I knew there were stories to be told. I knew he had experienced some really traumatic things. But of course at 15, I was also really fearful to ask him any questions about those things. It took another 25 years before I actually came to the stage where we could talk about it together. What happened was my mom gave me a call one day. I think I was probably folding laundry and my kids were getting ready for swim lessons or something like that. And my mom said, so we have an author friend and she'd like to write your dad's story. And I thought, she had that tone in her voice, you know, the one. And she said, hi, come on in. She said, I told her that my daughter is going to do that. Okay, so that was it, right? I didn't really have any options. Now, I couldn't say no, and I knew it was time, and I always wanted to do it. And I was 40, and my kids were getting a little older, and I had sort of this idea that it's possible. And I'd always loved to write. I'm an English teacher. I love literature and I love writing. And I thought, well, this is a great opportunity to start doing some writing courses as well. So I, took that opportunity. And my dad and I decided that, yeah, we were going to do this together. So for probably a year, maybe not quite so much, a year before we started meeting, I read everything I could about the Holocaust, about the Winter War, about survivor memoirs. That was really important to me. I'm a pretty emotional person, and I was fearful that I wouldn't be able to listen. I would be listening, and I'd probably just start to cry, and then, of course, he would be worried about how I was reacting, and that would be the end of it. He was a person who had suffered from insomnia probably all his life, and one time he told me, if you come around 3:30 in the morning, I'll be able to tell you what's going on in almost like a movie reel. Because he would wake up from nightmares in the middle of the night and just see this stuff replaying. So I thought, that says a lot, right? Why was he sort of an insomniac all those years? He'd been having nightmares for years and years and years. So this was a worry for me, that I would dredge up all these memories and it would make things worse for him. So that was one of our challenges. At the end of the day, I hope, I believe that it was therapeutic for him. I believe that he has fewer nightmares. I think he still has some. I feel like he's better able to talk to people about what happened to him in those years while he was in a concentration camp. But I don't think anything ever really goes away even after all those decades. So that was one of the concerns I had when we started. Another thing happened actually connected to coming to the Sioux. My brother and his wife and my mom and dad were on their way to the Sioux, and they were in Tom's driveway, and my dad was just trying to be helpful and get the garbage and bring it up to the front. And it was an icy day. I think it was probably February, maybe March, and he slipped on the ice and had a concussion. And they drove all the way to the Sioux. Like he said, oh, I'm fine. Very stoic, no problem. Got in the car, drove to come see Judith, and didn't know where he was, didn't know where he was going, didn't tell anybody anything, and they got here concerned about what had happened. A couple days later, when they were back in Sudbury, he did go to the doctor. He had a concussion. When I went to meet with him the following Sunday, he couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the stories. It was muddled. He was trying to tell me in Finnish, which I think part of our brain does that. It goes back to our first language when you're thinking about your childhood. So in terms of the process, like I say, we met every Sunday for a few hours, and at first I came prepared with all my questions, ready to ask him, a list of things, and it became apparent right away that he knew what he wanted to talk about that week. I just needed to listen. He started with his childhood in Oulu, Finland, and then at 11 years old, during the Winter War, his hometown of Oulu was bombed on January 1st. And so then I think life changes completely for him at 11. So from there, he brought me to the Merchant Marine. This is his ship here, actually, the Labu. And he was, I think, 15 when he told his parents he was leaving home. My daughter's 15 now. I can't even imagine her saying, I'm going to Helsinki, I'm going to find work, I'm going to go work on a ship. He did find work there. They did allow him to work there even though he was underage. I'm sure he lied about his age. They probably knew, but they needed men, right? And he was kind of big for his age. And so he got a job there on the merchant ship, traveling between Helsinki and Germany and Poland, delivering war materials. And so at that time, Finland and Germany were allies, and Finland was at war with Russia. So that was the circumstances. Then, when the war ended and the Moscow Armistice was signed, he was docked in Poland, in Danzig. And what happened was the boat was seized, I guess, and they had to stay in port. And eventually, they were taken from port and brought to a warehouse, and eventually to a dance hall. And they were trying to entice them. The Germans were trying to entice them to become, work for them. So join the army or the navy or come to work in a factory. And they all refused. All these Finnish sailors refused to do that. They ended up being brought to Stutthof concentration camp in Poland, about 34 kilometers away from Danzig. And this is where his story sort of stopped. He brought me to the gate of the concentration camp, and that's where we stayed. And the next week, I'm expecting that he's going to tell me what it was like inside, what the work details were like, what it was like, the food and the other prisoners and what the circumstances were. But that did not happen. Instead, he skipped right over that and went straight to after the war. And he told me about compulsory military service at 19. He talked about working in other merchant ships after the war. He told me stories about how he came to Canada and traveling all over Canada and working, and how he met my mom at Sample Hall at a dance. A lovely story. And so I had all these stories, and I said to my mom, these are really wonderful stories. I'm really happy to have them. And I've written them all down, and I was really thrilled about it. But I said, I don't know if this is going to happen. I don't think he can tell us the stories. And she said, like a good mother does, she knows best. She says, just be patient. Just be patient. Give him some time. It'll be fine. Okay. And so I, every week, went back and gathered more stories. And sometimes he'd repeat stories, which was great because I got more details and added more details. And eventually, we were working from beginning of January 2012 through the winter months, and as the spring came and the snow melted and the sun came out, he was ready, and he started to tell me the stories. And I think there's something interesting about that because, the dead of winter, I'm not sure he was ready to tell me about death marches through Poland in snowstorms. I don't know if he was capable of doing that. So spring came and his story started to flow. And then he started to tell me what it was like to be in the concentration camp and to be with, there was probably 90 Finnish sailors from 4 different ships. His wasn't the only ship. And there were, I want to say, maybe I'm getting the number wrong. I want to say 121 Norwegian policemen were there as well. And they were housed in Sunderlager, which is a camp just outside of the main camp in that initial time period. So I learned all about those things. He talked about the death march through Poland, and probably maybe half the people survived that march through the dead of winter. And he told me about a couple of opportunities to escape, which were unbelievable as well. I mean, the story is going on. And then he did have an escape effort that lasted for a little while, but then he was rearrested. And thankfully, rather than shoot him, they just sent him back to Stutthof concentration camp, where he spent some time in the main camp. And my husband and I actually traveled to Poland and Germany to see the concentration camp, and that was a very moving experience if you've ever gone to a camp. It's very, very chilling. Of course, you know that the place doesn't look exactly like it did at the time period, but it is, some of the buildings are still standing, and you have a really good sense of what things could have been like. And we had a really wonderful tour guide. He was, of course, we had requested him beforehand that we'd have an English-speaking guide. And he was a Polish man who had been imprisoned himself when he was a child in Germany, but he was Polish. And I explained to him why we were there, that we were, what had happened to my father, and he was very, businesslike. He brought us and showed us and explained things, and it was wonderful, very informative, and probably exactly what I needed, because I didn't want to be crying the whole time. And then at the end of the tour, then he gave me a giant hug, and his tears came flowing, and line to two, and this, the skies open and start to rain. What a moment. And we just embraced, and it was just this fantastic moment that he understood why I was there, right? And I think his business-like demeanor was simply to get through it without getting too emotional either. So here's a kindred spirit for sure. So being in that camp was really, really touching and moving for me to stand in the soil where my father had been. The barracks that he was housed in wasn't standing anymore, but they have sort of, I don't know if you can see in one of the pictures, shows you where the barracks were, and one of them looked over the crematory, and you could see the gas chamber. And he said that the bodies would be piled up beside the crematory waiting. Typhus was a deadly disease that decimated the population, and his windows overlooked that scene. I can't imagine what that would have been like. He said one of the things that was most chilling, I guess, every day they had sort of a cart, and at night people would pass away, and they would gather the dead and put them on the cart. And whose job that was to do that, I can't imagine, right? But everyone witnessed that cart every day moving, so it's a real reminder of what could happen. But he said that over time, it's strange how your mind can deal with that, and it becomes just part of the daily routine. And I think that's just unbelievable, that if that's your daily routine, you're witnessing that every day, and that's your only coping mechanism really, is just to distance yourself from that, right? So we had, some very, very difficult moments talking about the stories. A lot of the things were hard, and he took his time and often would come back to them, tell me parts, and then come back to them later and add, and that was the way to get through talking about it. But sometimes he said, a couple of times he said, don't write this down. And that's when I knew, oh no, right? That's when you put the armor on. Don't write this down. And I said, well, I'm just going to take some notes. And if you don't want to use this, we don't need to use this. So he had every opportunity from the first moment right to the very last moment to change, omit, take out anything, have me rewrite if it wasn't to him authentic. And when he told me, don't write this down, that's when you know that the story is going to be something that's super difficult for him to tell. One of those stories was difficult to hear because emotionally he was very, he was having a hard time telling it, so that was very hard. One of them was, there was a thief in their camp, in their barracks. So one of the Finnish sailors was stealing from the others. And so that to them was, reprehensible that you would steal from your own people, like in your own camp, your own Finnish sailors. And so they decided as a group that if we're gonna find this person and we have to punish them, and if we're gonna punish them, we all have to punish them. It can't be one person that's responsible, because that's so difficult to bear. So they all agreed that they would take part in the punishment of this thief. And so my dad was having a very difficult time explaining this to me, and I could just see it in his face. This is a fairly stoic man, and not a person who I see break down too often, but I did that day. And when he explained that when it came his turn to take I forget if it was like a belt or something, and it was his turn, he had to strike this man, how difficult that was. So I understood that was a powerful moment for him, and I didn't know if that would stay in the book. I wrote it, I left it there and said, tell me what you want to do with this. And he left it. He said, no, that it happened and it needs to be told. And I felt like that's strength, right? So there's a few moments like that where in the moment he couldn't do it. He did want to share that story, but at the end of the day, he did leave those stories, and I think he understood the importance of them. So we had our challenges for sure writing this together, but we also had some really neat experiences as well. We went to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I don't know if you know about that, Washington, D.C. We took a road trip. My mother-in-law, my husband, my kids, my mom, my dad, we got in a minivan, we rented a minivan, took a road trip. That was fantastic. All the way to Washington, D.C. And my dad had always wanted to go to the Holocaust Museum there. So this was our opportunity. And we'd been meeting for probably 6 or 7 months, and we said, let's go. And we walked through the museum together, and he'd pause and talk about different things that reminded him of stories. And we just spent an awful lot of time there. But before we even got to the museum part, we were walking into the main building. I don't know if you've been there, but it's this very beautiful, striking building with glass above you and steel girders and brick walls, and it feels prison-like in some ways, but then there's sunlight pouring into this space. It's just quite amazing. And for whatever reason, it was a Wednesday morning, my dad beelined it to the back, and there was a woman sitting at a table, and he started to talk to her. Her name was Nessie Godin. She was a Holocaust survivor, and immediately they made a connection. Nessie was 16 when she was in concentration camp, so was my dad. Nessie only worked on Wednesday mornings as a volunteer. That's the only time we've ever been there. Things are twigging for me. And Nessie was in the same concentration camp as my dad. So that was unbelievable, because even she said she rarely met anyone from that camp because so few people ever survived. So it was just unbelievable. And they made an immediate connection, of course, and we were all in tears at that point. So we went through the museum, and another touching moment I felt that happened in the museum was, I think I may have a picture of it. There's the train cars. They're sort of reddish-brown color, sort of for cattle or for farming or whatever. We walked into a room and he saw that, and it was like lit, so it was sort of a dark room, and the train car was lit. And he just sort of stopped and said, that's the kind of car that transported me to Stutthof. And he was just sort of in awe that this was in the building. The Polish government had donated it to the museum, actually. And there was an opportunity to walk around it, and there was an opportunity to walk through it. And we stood just outside of that train car. And my mother-in-law actually said, Arnie, you can walk around. And my dad stood there. Oh, I might cry. He stood in front of that car and thought about it, and then he went in, and he went through and came out very emotional, but I think that was something he needed to do. So that was a very moving moment for us, for sure. So then we actually went to the Holocaust Museum a second time the following spring, because it was the 20th anniversary of the Holocaust Museum, and because he was a survivor, he was invited to be acknowledged. And I think that was a very key moment for him because, well, first of all, it was a grand event. They had streets cordoned off. They had, all kinds of things happening. We had this gigantic dinner, and ex-President Clinton spoke. And for me, Elie Wiesel, if you know him, he's a survivor, and he wrote Night. He was a keynote speaker. So for me, that was just amazing to hear him speak. And we were surrounded by survivors and by veterans. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful event for him to go to. And I think for me, that really acknowledged to him the importance of us doing this work together. And also that what he had gone through was validated. Because he had gone through many years where he didn't tell the stories to very many people. In the early years, nobody wanted to hear them. In the early years, people said that didn't happen. They had their own stories that had happened there, but they didn't want to talk about it. There was a real sense of you hide those away. And when he did talk about them, it was very to only certain people and only a little bit. So, and then here we are in a room filled with people who understood and had been through something similar. It was extremely powerful. And like I say, my husband and I went to Poland and Germany the following year, and that for me was sort of an essential thing to do, to see those places where he'd been, to have a sense of what it might have been like. We went to the place where he was liberated, and on the day that he was liberated, I don't know if you may have read the book already, but on the day that he was liberated, the British bombed some ships that were in the harbor, the Capricorn and the Theelbeck, and 7,000 prisoners died that day, and he witnessed that, and he actually was almost about to be on one of those ships himself. So it was this really traumatic event, and yet it was the day he was liberated, so the most wonderful day and the most horrible day wrapped into one. And so when my husband and I went to see this place, Neustadt in Germany, it's a resort town, and it's beautiful, sandy beaches, and there's gulls flying and kids playing at the beach, and the water was crystal clear and beautiful blue, and it was just stunning to be there. But then to think about what had happened there 70 years before. There is a monument to the concentration camp victims of that day, 7,000 prisoners, and bicyclists would drive their bike up to the gate, open the gate, and out of respect get off their bike and walk past the monument and then get on their way on the other side. So they still have tribute to the prisoners, but in some ways I kind of felt it's good, right? But after all those years, this is a beautiful place where people enjoy life, and it's the way it should be, the way it should have been. This is a scene when the Finnish sailors have been housed in a dance hall. This is after their ship has been, they've been arrested, and they were in a warehouse, and now they're in this sort of dance hall. A week passed in the makeshift prison. One morning, the click-clacking sound of hobnailed jackboots crossing the wooden floor startled the sailors as they slumped against the dance hall walls. The Nazi officers in their pressed gray-green uniforms, stamped aluminum insignia displayed on their chests, slate gray trousers tucked into their tall black boots, peak caps placed securely under their arms, strode towards the long table set up end to end at the far side of the room. The snap, snap, snap of the latches as they opened their leather attaché cases echoed in the silence. In the back corner, where he sat with his knees tucked to his chest, Arnie began to tremble. The Finnish sailors were weary, hungry, and disheveled. The Germans had been confining them for several weeks. They had only enough energy to watch the officers as they took their seats, spreading their documents across a long table. They sat with straight backs in wooden chairs facing the prisoners. "Line up here," a tall, thin man pointed to an area in front of the tables. The sailors stood in straight rows while the officers eyed the bedraggled men up and down. They showed no expressions on their pale faces. The men shuffled back and forth on their feet. A single set of jackboots crossed the floor. "Welcome to Germany," his deep announcer's voice echoed against the walls. "You will have a good life here." Arnie watched his face smile encouragingly at the sailors. All you need to do is come here and sign up with one of these officers. He walked up and down the rows, looking at the sailors. You may wish to join the Army. Perhaps you would prefer the Navy since you are sailors. Or you may want to join the Air Force. Maybe you would like to work at a good German factory. Step forward. Sign up. The sailors glanced nervously at each other, but nobody moved. Please, please, you will like Germany. You'll be treated well and have much to eat. Life is good in Germany. Sign here with these officers. His easy manner began to show signs of irritation. Nobody goes. Nobody signs anything, Captain Jansen instructed the sailors. One by one, the Finnish crews left the row and moved towards the back of the hall in protest. Arnie left the line, turning his back on the officers at the table, and joined a small group of his friends sitting on the floor. The officers remained at the front on their own, smiles changing to scowls. Within minutes, an ocean-wide expanse had appeared across the dance hall between the Germans and the Finns. The officers leaned over the table, mumbling to one another. A few minutes later, a member of the Gestapo arrived. His voice thundered through the hall. Angry orders replaced the encouraging words. Whoever doesn't work during this war doesn't eat. You must get up. You must sign these papers. For several minutes, the men roared at the sailors. They listened in fear, but refused to move. Finally, the officers gathered their documents and placed them in their briefcases. The chairs scraped the wooden floor as the men pushed them away from the table. With some relief, the sailors listened as the tapping sound of the jackboots diminished in the distance. But Arnie worried about their fate as he huddled with the others. Transportation to Sweden was a ruse. Finland, his home, seemed very far away. At dawn, on October 21st, almost a month after their initial arrest, the sailors, some snoozing in awkward positions on the floor, others dozing in semi-seated positions against the walls, awoke as a group of armed Nazi soldiers barged into the hall. "Time to get moving, you lazy pigs," the soldiers shouted, kicking sleeping bodies. In a matter of minutes, the Finns were standing at attention. Arnie grabbed his jacket before the soldiers drove him outside. The Germans jostled the sailors down the middle of the street, past shattered buildings and piles of debris. They had no idea where they were headed. Already a few citizens with horses and buggies were beginning their day. Women carrying bundles, trailed by children, stopped to stare as the group passed. The sailors marched to the railroad station, where small, windowless wooden rail cars stood with open doors on a narrow gauge railway. The train looked like it was for hauling cattle or wheat, not human beings. "Get in." Using the butts of their rifles, the soldiers hit several of the sailors, driving them towards the reddish-brown rail cars. Arnie's whole body tensed as he witnessed the violence. He tried to stay with his own group, away from the beatings. He pulled himself up and squeezed himself into the car, which was already stuffed full of bodies crushed one against the other. The door of the train shut with a resounding crash, followed by the scraping of the heavy latch into its socket. The guards locked the sailors into the suffocating prison. All that remained was darkness.
Well, in Finnish, we say kiitos, which means thank you. And thank you for sharing your hard time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.